The Battle of Hill 70 was a battle of World War I between the Canadian Corps and 5 divisions of the German Sixth Army. The battle took place along the Western Front on the outskirts of Lens in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais region of France between 15 and 25 August 1917. The objectives of the assault were to inflict casualties and to draw German troops away from the Third Battle of Ypres, rather than to capture territory. The Canadian Corps executed an operation designed to first occupy the high ground at Hill 70 quickly and then establish defensive positions, from which combined small arms and artillery fire, some of which used the technique of predicted fire for the first time, could be used to repel German counter-attacks and inflict as many casualties as possible. A later attempt by the Canadian Corps to extend its position into the city of Lens itself failed. Both sides suffered high casualties and Lens remained under German control. In both the German and the Canadian assessments of the battle, it succeeded in its attrition objective. The battle consisted of extensive use of poison gas by both sides, including the newly introduced German Yellow Cross shell containing the blistering agent sulfur mustard. Ultimately, the goals of the Canadian Corps were only partially accomplished. The Canadians were successful in preventing German formations from transferring local men and equipment to aid in defensive operations in the Ypres salient, but failed to draw in troops from other areas. Background: the industrial coal city of Lens, France had fallen under German control in October 1914 during the Race to the Sea. Consequently, the Germans also controlled the heights at Hill 70 to the north of the city and Saromines Hill to the southeast, both of which had commanding views over the surrounding area as well as the city itself. Hill 70 was a treeless expanse at the end of one of the many spurs. In September 1915, the British had overrun the hill during the Battle of Ypres but had not managed to hold it. British First Army Commander General Henry Horne ordered the Canadian Corps to relieve First Corps from the position opposite the city of Lens on 10 July 1917 and directed Canadian Corps Commander Arthur Currie to develop a plan for capturing the town by the end of July 1917. The operation was intended to engage as many German formations as possible and to prevent them from reinforcing the Ypres sector during the Third Battle of Ypres. Command of the Canadian Corps had only recently changed. A month earlier, Canadian Corps Commander Julian Byng was promoted to the rank of general and replaced General Edmund Allenby as commander of the British Third Army. In turn, 1st Canadian Division Commander Arthur Currie was promoted to Lieutenant General and assumed command of the Canadian Corps. Tactical plan: Currie regarded control of either Hill 70 or Saromines Hill as tactically more important than control of the city of Lens. Merely to occupy the city while the Germans held the high ground would place the attackers in an unfavorably lower and more exposed position than the ones they occupied. At a conference of corps commanders, Currie persuaded the First Army Commander General Henry Horne to make Hill 70, not Lens, the main objective of the limited offensive. Controlling Hill 70 would provide excellent observation over the German lines in preparation for more offensives. Currie believed the Germans would attempt to counter-attack if Hill 70 were captured, largely because of its observational importance. Nevertheless, Currie believed that the advantageous observational position of Hill 70 would permit well-directed artillery to effectively deal with any counter-attacks. The plan was therefore to occupy the high ground quickly, establish defensive positions and utilize combined small arms and artillery fire to repel expected counter-attacks and inflict as many casualties as possible. In an attempt to further deceive the Germans, minor operations were conducted in an effort to suggest a forthcoming attack by the British First Army south of le Bas-Canal. This included an attack by the 9th Canadian Brigade against units of the German 36th Reserve Division at Mericourt Trench and a British 1st Army poison gas attack north of Loos, both in late July 1917. Bad weather led to the postponement of the attack on Hill 70 from late July until mid-August. In the interim, special companies of the Royal Engineers augmented the regular level of harassment by firing a total of 3,500 gas drums and 900 gas shells into Lens by the 15th of August. The artillery neutralized 40 out of an estimated 102 German batteries in the area by 0 hour, partly with the technique of predicted fire for the first time, using datum points and calibrated guns, which greatly improved the accuracy of the artillery. Troops were rotated through the reserve area to conduct training and rehearsals in preparation for the assault. These obvious preliminary actions to an attack did not go unnoticed by the Germans, which made it impossible to conceal the First Army's general intentions or even, as it turned out, the date of the assault. The best that could be done was to attempt to mislead the Germans with respect to time and place. To this end, First Corps staged exercises with dummy tanks on the 14th of August directly west of Lens. The battle. Opposing forces. Canadian Corps Commander Lieutenant General Arthur Currie had 3 attacking divisions, 1 division in reserve and numerous support units under his command. German 6th Army Commander General Air Infantry Otto von Bülow was responsible for the area between Lille and Cambrai. Hill 70 and the area surrounding it was defended by the ad hoc Gruppe Loos. The defending elements of the German 6th Army consisted of the 7th Division, 4th Guards Division, 185th Division, 11th Reserve Division and 220th Division. The plan to capture Hill 70 called for the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions to attack on a front of 4,000 yards. Their objective was to capture the main enemy defensive positions on the eastern reverse slope of Hill 70. The objectives were marked off in depth by 3 stages. In the first stage, the assaulting troops would capture the German front-line trench, the German second position on the crest of the hill during the second stage, and the final stage marked by the German third line. On the reverse side of the slope, some 1,500 yards from the starting position, the 1st Canadian Division's 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade would attack north of Hill 70, while the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade would attack the summit. The 2nd Canadian Division's 4th and 5th Canadian Infantry Brigades would attack the rubble remains of the suburbs of Cité-Saint-Édouard Street, Laurent and Saint-Émile directly south of Hill 70. The assault began at 4:25 a.m. on the morning of the 15th of August, just as dawn was breaking. Special companies of the Royal Engineers fired drums of burning oil into the suburb of Cité Street, Elizabeth and at other selected targets to supplement the artillery creeping barrage and build up a smoke screen. Divisional field artillery positions executed a creeping barrage directly in advance of the assaulting troops, while field howitzers shelled German positions 400 meters in advance of the creeping barrage, and heavy howitzers shelled all other known German strong points. Artillery forward observation officers moved forward with the infantry, and artillery observation aircraft flew overhead and sent 240 calls for artillery fire by wireless. The Germans had moved up the reserve units on the previous night in anticipation of an attack, and the main assembly of Canadian troops was detected by 3 3:00 a.m., and within 3 minutes of the attack commencing, the German artillery brought down defensive fire at widely scattered points. The affected forward positions of the German 7th Division and 11th Reserve Division were quickly overwhelmed. Within 20 minutes of the attack beginning, both Canadian divisions had reached the first objective. By 6:00 a.m., the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade had reached the second objective line, while units in the other three brigades had in some cases already reached the final objective. Only the flanking companies of the two battalions attacking Hill 70 managed to reach their objectives. The remainder of the both units were forced to retreat up the slope and consolidate the position at the intermediate objective line. On the right flank of the 2nd Canadian Division, the 12th Canadian Infantry Brigade of the 4th Canadian Division executed a diversionary operation which proved successful in drawing German retaliatory fire away from the main operation. 4 hours later, the 11th Canadian Infantry Brigade of the 4th Canadian Division attempted to exploit the weakened German force by pushing strong patrols towards the center of Lens. This ultimately failed as the Germans used local counter-attacks across the 4th Canadian Division's front to drive the patrols back to the city's outskirts. Initial counter-attacks. In preparation for German counter-attacks, the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions began to reinforce and construct strong points immediately after capturing the first objective line. Within 2 hours of the start of the battle, the Germans began using their immediate reserves to mount local counter-attacks. Between 7:00 a.m. and 9:00 a.m. on the morning of the 15th of August, the Germans executed 4 local attacks against Canadian positions. Each attack was repulsed due in large part to the work of forward artillery observers, who could now overlook some of the German positions. On one occasion, the counter-attack was only repulsed after engaging in hand-to-hand fighting. The Germans rapidly brought up 7 additional battalions from the 4th Guards Division and 185th Division to reinforce the 8 line battalions already in place. Over the following 3 days, the Germans executed no less than 21 counterattacks against Canadian positions. A frontal attack against the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade on the afternoon of the 15th of August ultimately failed. A German attack against the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade was initially successful, with the Germans recapturing Chicory Trench but were repulsed. Later the same afternoon, capture of Hill 70 and additional counter-attacks the morning of the 16th of August was relatively quiet, with only a few attempts made by small German parties to approach the Canadian lines. After having failed to capture all their objectives the previous day and having postponed additional attacks a number of times, the 2nd Canadian Brigade attacked and captured the remainder of its final objective line on the afternoon of the 16th of August. The assault lasted a little over an hour, but the troops were then forced to defend against a dozen German counter-attacks during the day. Attempts by the 4th and 11th Canadian Infantry Brigades to eliminate an enemy salient between Cité Street, Elizabeth and Lens on the 17th of August failed, and as had been foreseen, the Germans continued to mount determined counterattacks. The German command began to realize that the Canadian and British artillery would need to be neutralized before a counter-attack could succeed. The Germans began a series of counter-attacks against a chalk quarry under Canadian control outside of Cité Street, August, but also sought to wear down the Canadian artillery resources by sending up false flare signals that provoking the infantry to call for unnecessary artillery fire. The Germans also began to use poison gas in earnest. From 15,000 - 20,000 of the new Yellow Cross shells containing the blistering agent sulfur mustard were fired in addition to an undetermined number of shells containing diphosgene. The Canadian 1st and 2nd Artillery Field Brigades and the Canadian front line were heavily gassed. Many artillerymen became casualties after gas fogged the goggles of the respirators and they were forced to remove the masks to set the fuses, lay the sights and maintain accurate fire. The Germans used the cover of gas to make a number of attempts against the Canadian-controlled Chalk Quarry and Chicory Trench on the night of 17 August and early morning of the 18th of August. All attempts against the Chalk Quarry failed and only one company of the 55th Reserve Infantry Regiment managed to breach the Canadian defences at Chicory Trench before being repulsed. German troops employing flamethrowers managed to penetrate the Canadian line north of the quarry on the morning of the 18th of August before being driven out. Attack on Lens. The front quieted significantly after the final attack against the Chalk Quarry. For the Canadian Corps, the following 2 days consisted largely of consolidation activities. The front line was drawn back 300 yards midway between the original intermediate and final objective lines. The 4th Division slightly advanced its forward posts on the outskirts of Lens and extended its front northward to include the Lens-Bethune Road. Currie wished to further improve the position around Hill 70 and ordered an attack against enemy positions along a 3,000-yard front, opposite the 2nd and 4th Canadian Divisions. The operation was scheduled for the morning of the 21st of August, the tasks being divided between the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade on the left and the 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade on the right. The attack was to begin at 4:35 a.m., but the Germans began shelling the Canadian positions at 4 o'clock a.m., and just before the Canadian attack, the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade's left flank was attacked by units of the German 4th Guards Division. Both forces met between the respective objectives, fought hand-to-hand and with the bayonet. In the melee, the 6th Brigade advance was stopped. Communication between the forward units and brigade headquarters had broken down at the beginning of the attack and could not be restored due to heavy German shelling, making it all but impossible to coordinate the infantry and artillery. Counter-attacks by the 4th Guards Division, reinforced by a battalion of the 220th Infantry Division, forced the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade back to the start line. On the right flank, in the 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade, one unit suffered a large number of shellfire casualties while assembling for the attack and were met the massed artillery and machine gun fire as they neared their objective. Only 3 small parties, the largest of not more than 20 men, reached the goal. The other 2 attacking units captured their objectives later in the evening and a salient was created in the 4th Canadian Division line. On the evening of the 21st of August, 3 parties went forward to bomb the German position from the flanks but were only moderately successful. An additional attack planned for the 22nd of August failed to materialize due to battalion-level misunderstandings. A brigade reserve unit was ordered to remedy the situation by attacking a slag heap called Green Crassier and the mine complex at Foss Street, Louis. The attack was repulsed, with the majority of the attackers being killed, wounded or taken prisoner. The Germans held on to the possession until the beginning of the final German retreat in 1918. Aftermath analysis. The Germans refrained from attempts to recapture the lost ground at Lens, due to the demands of defensive operations of the Third Battle of Ypres and the need to avoid the diversion of forces from the main effort. Subsequent operations, the remainder of August, all of September and the beginning of October were relatively quiet, with Canadian efforts devoted mainly to preparations for another offensive, although none took place, largely because the British First Army lacked sufficient resources for the task. Instead, the Canadian Corps was transferred to the Ypres sector in early October in preparation for the Second Battle of Passchendaele. Soon after the battle, German Sixth Army Commander General der Infantry Otto von Bülow was transferred to the Italian front, where he took command of the newly formed Austro-German 14th Army. In this capacity, he executed an extremely successful offensive at the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917. General der Infantry Ferdinand von Quast took over command of the German Sixth Army until the end of the war. Victoria Cross. 6 Victoria Crosses, the highest military decoration for valor awarded to British and Commonwealth forces, were awarded to members of the Canadian Corps for their actions during the battle: Private Harry Brown of the 10th Battalion, Company Sergeant Major Robert Hill Hanna of the 29th Battalion, Sergeant Frederick Hobson of the 20th Battalion, Corporal Philip Conole of the 47th Battalion, Acting Major Oakle Massey Lermonth of the 2nd Battalion, Private Michael James O'Rourke of the 7th Battalion,